Okay, today we're going to talk about human nature some more, building on the discussion we had about Steven Pinker's lecture, and we'll talk about him a little bit at the end of the lecture today. But as you've probably noticed, we're moving into a different phase of the course, where instead of talking about writing primarily and tricks to writing papers, we're going to talk about some of the big questions that people have asked in the humanities and in the social sciences and in the natural sciences. And the question we're going to start with, what is a human being, is at the heart of almost everything human beings have done to try to understand themselves and the world. And every religious tradition, every cultural tradition has had some discussion and some history of looking at the question of what are human beings? Are we children of God? Are we highly evolved apes with opposable thumbs? Are we naturally good? Are we naturally evil? Are we aggressive? Are we altruistic? Are we caring? Are we loving? Are we all of this into some incredibly complicated genetic soup that we can't quite understand? These can be very difficult questions, but they all begin with the two positions outlined in the readings by Mencius and Shunsa. Position A, human beings are naturally good. Position B, human beings are naturally bad. Let's look at them. Confucius was probably the most famous philosopher of the ancient world. If you look all over the world and how many people he influenced, nobody's quite sure what he said. And that's not to say that he wasn't clear, because most of his sentences were clear, but he never put it all together into anything systematic. A lot like Jesus or Socrates, he just said things and other people wrote them down and compiled them after he was dead. And it wasn't until 50 to 100 years after Confucius' death that his sayings became the basis for a systematic philosophy of life, where people said this is what Confucius meant and began to apply it into how to live. We're fairly sure that Confucius thought a lot about human nature. And his main argument, the main thing he says in his Analects or his writings, is that people should follow rituals in order to perfect themselves. Now, he doesn't tell you which rituals to follow. He thinks you should know. He says you should follow the rituals of whatever place you live in. And he assumed that everybody would know what the right rituals would be, what the right rites, the right procedures and religious observances would be. Well, he had two disciples after he died that fashioned his sayings into much more systematic philosophies. Mencius is often known as the happy Confucian. He believed that Confucius's philosophy stemmed from the belief that people are naturally good, that people are perfectible, their nature is agreeable, and because people want to be good, the rites and rituals that Confucius advocated help them perfect their nature. Now, Shunsa, who was the unhappy Confucian, he believed exactly the opposite. He was a Confucian who believed that Confucius's emphasis on rites and rituals was precisely because Confucius believed that human beings were evil, that without the rites and the rituals that Confucius advocated, people would not have a chance to be good. Now let's skip ahead to the European Enlightenment. And this is the time in England and Germany and France and Italy and other European countries in the 16 and 17 and part of the 1800s. And this is the time when the scientific revolution is beginning in Europe, and when Newton and other scientists are looking at the underlying laws of nature and motion. And the philosophers are doing the same thing. A lot of philosophers believe that they can deduce the laws that govern human nature. And a lot of the philosophers of this time believed in what we call now the social contract, or an imaginary but binding contract that individuals make with the society or the government that they're a part of, that sacrifices some of their liberty in exchange for protection. And there were a lot of very different views of the social contract. And like Shunsa and Mencius, the different views of the social contract depended on different views of what the philosophers called the state of nature. which is an imaginary time, but kind of a philosophical thought experiment for them, where they imagined what human beings would be like if there were no society, because they understood at this time that society had a lot to do with people's values. People believed things and thought things according to the societies that they belonged to. So what would human beings look like without society? And in this imaginary state of nature, Thomas Hobbes, a very famous British philosopher, believed that human beings were violent and selfish, and he famously said that in the state of nature, the life of human beings is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Which means that as long as we're by ourselves with no society to intervene, we're going to kill each other and take away our stuff. Take away stuff from whoever we're big enough to take it away from until somebody kills us and takes our stuff away. And that's no way to live. So, Hobbes believed, human beings, out of their own best interests, formed civil societies, and in those civil societies, they sacrificed the freedoms of the state of nature in order to get the protections of a civil state. Rousseau was almost exactly the opposite. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was an important figure in the time that led up to the French Revolution. And he wrote a book called Émile, which is a novel about a young boy's education, but it's really a treatise on education. He believed that human beings come from God, good and moral and pure, and that they are corrupted by society, and it is society that teaches us how to hate, society that teaches us how to be greedy and selfish and to look to our own interests, and that if people could just be like God made them, then they would be able to get along with each other. And Rousseau believed that the social contract is one in which we exchange a very small amount of our liberty in order for the society of other people with whom we can perfect ourselves. And these two views during the Enlightenment became the basis for what we call classical conservative philosophy and classical liberal philosophy, which doesn't correspond very well to what we in America call a liberal and a conservative. But in classical conservatism, which is Hobbes, it's also Edmund Burke, it's also Thomas Malthus, and to some extent Sigmund Freud, were classical conservatives who believed that human nature was inherently corrupt and that there had to be some sort of religious or government superstructure to make people straight. Classical liberalism really begins with Rousseau and with both the American and the French revolutions. This is the idea that people are basically good and can govern themselves and don't need a government straightening them out. And these two different philosophies have been in conflict with each other for pretty much all of human history, and they remain extremely important philosophies today, and they're based just on a different starting point. Both philosophies believe that humans have good and bad in them, but different starting points on how human beings are all by themselves without society intervening. And modern psychologists are still fighting this battle. There are still people on both sides of the issue, some who see human nature as that. People don't use good and evil in psychology anymore, but there are people who see human nature as primarily aggressive, and some who see human nature as primarily altruistic. As evolutionary psychology has become the dominant way of looking at human cognition, we've sort of seen a merging together of the Mencius and the Schunze position, or the Hobbes and the Rousseau position. Evolutionary psychologists today see that there are strong survival and self-protection mechanisms in human nature, that we are selfish, we want to survive, we want to reproduce, and that's what evolution has bred into us. At the same time, human beings evolved to be part of societies. We're one of the few species, there are others, but we are a species that evolved to be social, and other people are a very important part of human survival and always have been. So we have real, genuine altruistic feelings for one another, for our own kin, mothers and children, for example, but also just for other people that we interact with or are in a community with. And we can't ignore those either. And this is what Steven Pinker talks about in his most recent, very controversial, and I think very excellent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which people can expect to see in the third edition of Reading the World. As you've already seen, Steven Pinker argues that over the last 10,000 years or so, societal violence has decreased remarkably, and that just in the last 100 years, the increasing organization of political states has brought violence down in the world. Even though you've had lots of violence and lots of war in the 20th century, Pinker argues that this is less than we have seen in previous centuries and far less than we experienced when we were hunter-gatherers, most of whom killed each other before they were 30. For reasons that Pinker talks about, and all of these have to do with society and social organizations. State monopolies on violence. And this is something that Hobbes talks about. In primitive societies, the greatest destabilizing factor is what some philosophers call mimetic violence. And that is, I kill one of your friends, you kill me, one of my friends kills your friends and family, and that becomes a Hatfields and McCoy kind of blood feud. And when the state has a monopoly on violence, or when the state does most of the punishing, then it usually stops with the state. That doesn't breed the kinds of feuding, the kind of blood feuds that engulfed early primitive societies and just took them down, just involved everybody in these kinship-based feuds. Trade, international trade, I think Pinker sees as something that has driven a decline in violence because it's just more profitable to trade with people than to kill them all now. You know, we don't need to exterminate our rivals. We just need to sell to them, and they become our markets. Public censure, whereas in a lot of countries, especially in the West, you get really criticized if you advocate or enact certain kinds of violence. You know, racist violence, violence against women now, is the subject of a lot of criticism in America and in a lot of the world. And this censure imposes a shame cost on people who commit violent acts and makes it a better deal not to be violent in a lot of situations than to be violent. And finally, technology has increased our contact with each other. And 200 years ago, this meant books that we read and experienced other minds in. Now it means Facebook. It means the internet. It means social media. It means we're constantly interacting with people, and the better we know people, the more empathy we have for people. At least that's Pinker's argument. And so what he's saying here is that there have been things that have happened over the last couple of hundred years that have steered us towards, in many, but not all cases, towards the more altruistic sides of our natures and away from the more violent or selfish sides of our natures. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to now start thinking about it and entering the conversation about human nature. Look at all of the historical arguments. Look at your own experience with yourself, with the people that you know, and start to explain on the bulletin board what kind of creatures you think human beings are. Are we good, evil, altruistic, antagonistic, selfish, caring? Most of you are going to find that we have elements of both. How do these elements interact with each other? In what proportions are we one or the other? And how can we structure our society to bring out these better angels of our nature? How can we structure a society that emphasizes the more positive traits and steers us away from the more negative traits that human beings have always had? That's your task. I will look forward to what you have to say on the bulletin boards.